Hey, how's it going everyone? It's been a while since we've had one of these 1.0 versus 2.0 videos. I did a bit of a poll on the YouTube community section a while ago asking what video you guys want, and this one came out on top, so here we are. And I do apologise for the delay. I was planning to get this done at the end of 2021, but unfortunately timing didn't quite work out. But anyway, here we are now. Hopefully we'll have more of these videos coming throughout 2022 as well. But this is definitely what I've been looking forward to for a while. But out of all the 1.0 versus 2.0 figures, I think this is probably the one with the biggest difference. And even though this came in 2013, so like almost 10 years ago, like 8-9 years ago, and he holds up really well. So yeah, 2013 release, and then I believe it was 2017 for the 2.0 Vegeta. So even, he came out what, about 4 years after the original release, and yeah, there is a big difference in terms of kind of articulation and quality due to the body type. But I feel despite this one being a new one, I do think the 1.0 is the better option. Though we will get a quick look at what each one comes with, the kind of range of articulation on each, roughly compared to each other, and then we'll have some final thoughts as well at the end of the video. So anyway, let's jump in and check out the 1.0 contents. Okay, so if you've got the 2.0 figure, you'll be noticing a pretty much a drastic difference straight away, and that is the Ki Blast, which does come with a 1.0 along with a full-on body shading, which also appears on all the hands as well. This is something that's drastically lacking from the later figures, but anyway, let's just quickly go over what he does come with. So you've got the main body in the center with the tail wrapped around his waist. He's got the two-part Ki Blast. He's got the hand crushing the Scouter, additional 2-finger one, and then 1, 2, 3 sets of hands, along with the folded arm look down the bottom, the extra tail, 3 additional expressions, and then a separate head as well. And then we've got the loose Scouter in the top center. So a decent amount of accessories. And if you're new to the collecting, you might be wondering what this magical item at the back is, and this is a stand. And surprisingly, the older figures did come with them, especially if there was a Ki Blast or the figure was a bit more bulky or heavier. They came with a stand to hold the figure, something that they stopped doing these days, which is a huge shame. Though you can get packs of these stands for pretty cheap now, but it'd still be good if figures came from them. There's been a few recent releases which really could have done with a additional stand included in the packaging. So yeah, that's the 1.0. Let's take a look at the 2.0. Okay, so we've got the 2.0 here, and now looking at these side by side, you must be thinking to yourself, damn, this Vegeta must have been one hell of a great retail, cheap, budget release. Well, actually, he's more expensive than the 1.0 by about 1,500 yen roughly. Though, I mean, admittedly, he did come about 4 years later, and I think between that point there was a tax increase in Japan, which kind of does explain why the pricing went up. Generally, at that point when the tax went from 5 to 8% and then again to 10% in Japan, a lot of the companies, they kind of took that as a chance to do a bit of a budget cutting on their figures or releases. Some companies increased prices, others just reduced quality or adjustments here and there. So one of them, I feel, for Tamashii was the removing of the weathering, since that obviously does drive up pricing a bit more in production. And yeah, other companies, for example, Yu-Gi-Oh cards, in Japan they used to have a really nice glossy finish on them. When that tax went up, they lost that extra coating. So while everything was the same price for the same quantity, the quality definitely dropped down. I feel like that is the same with the figures we got from Tamashii around that time period. While I don't have the exact stats or figures on those reasoning, I feel like it's a pretty safe assumption to assume that is why the quality did dip down with the figures, and why we do kind of get less accessories, no stands and so forth these days. But anyway, let's just jump into what he comes with. Straight away, he's got the arms folded attached to his body with a Scouter on his face as well, and he's got the extra tail on the side here. He does have one wrapped around his body, which might be a bit hard to see. He's also got the crushing Scouter look, and then just only 2 additional sets of hands. They're kind of martial arts gripping ones, and then open palm ones. Though he does have the closed fist on his arms over to the side here. And he comes with 3 additional expressions, faces. So pretty similar to what the original one came with, but obviously less hands and no key blast. Another big difference is actually the sizing, which we'll get a bit of a closer look at shortly. The original one is a little bit more stubbier, whereas the 2.0 definitely is slightly taller. Okay, so I switched the arms on the 2.0 Vegeta here so we can get a bit of a more equal comparison when we look at these two figures together. And straight away you can kind of notice a slight difference in the height between these two figures. I mean, it isn't huge, but I do feel like the 1.0 height is a better representation of Vegeta himself. I mean, he's not exactly the tallest character in the series, so seeing him a little bit more shorter, a bit more stockier, I think really lends to his character design overall compared to the 2.0 figure. Now obviously in terms of colouring and shading there is a huge difference. The 2.0 has a lighter, more orangey colour on his armour, whereas the 1.0 has it slightly, I'm not even sure if you'd say mustard, but kind of more on a brown earthier tone for that armour. And he does have the weathering and lining on there as well with the brown colour, which really does make them pop. Along with the weathering, he does have a blue on his armour and then the deeper, darker colours on his legs as well to make those muscles and the definition of his legs really pop through. And he does have the extra blue weathering on his pants and gloves. On his boots and gloves. Whereas the 2.0 is basically straight out of a mould, no difference there with any shading and colouring. And that is one of the main things which is really lacking with 2.0 in comparison. He doesn't really have that nice pop. He's very clean, looks like he's basically just come out of the laundromat, whereas with 1.0 definitely looks a bit more battle worn and ready. He's been out in the thick of things, so he has that kind of nice rougher look, which I think does kind of suit him. And despite being a prince, generally when we do see him, he's kind of out in the field. I mean, one of the first scenes is with him in Nappa after battle, chowing down on one of the inhabitants. So I think the colouring really does lead well to the 1.0. Though the 2.0 on the Scouter, you can see the advancement in technology, I guess. They're able to do the extra more fine printing on them, and the sculpting and detailing on his face does look nicer. Now the 1.0 one here, well, he does look like Vegeta. I mean, if you see it, you go, that's Vegeta. But I mean, it's a little bit rough. It kind of lacks that real fine definition. I almost kind of feel like when you're looking at old figures compared to the ones especially released in the last year, it's kind of looking at a standard definition versus a high definition movie. The new ones just really have those extra crisp lines which make the character expressions really pop. And the detailing and extra fine sculpting on the 2.0 is definitely a clear winner there. So, I mean, it's one of those things you kind of find the balancing act for yourself, whether you want more realistic, nice looking colours versus the definition on the facing themselves. But yeah, overall I do think both these figures do look good, though obviously my clear favourite one is the 1.0 due to the colouring, sizing and shading. Okay, before we jump into the articulation and the extra accessories for the two figures, I do have the Saiyan Res on Earth Goku and the original Nappa release here as well for a good size comparison. I mean, when you look at the 2.0 Vegeta next to the Goku, I mean, Vegeta is slightly taller, just overall kind of slightly bigger, and does look a bit weird. I mean, it's next to Nappa, it's not so noticeable since Nappa is such a beast of a figure anyway, though when you see the 1.0 versus Nappa, the size comparison starts to kind of fall in line a lot better. His head is almost with his upper forearm there, and by his shoulder, and then next to Goku definitely is shorter, which is really nice to see. So I'm really hoping we get a new Vegeta release which is more in line with the 1.0. I guess the main thing that we're really lacking from the S.H Figuarts line, besides more Dragonball releases, is Vegeta figures. So to get a additional Scouter version would be absolutely fantastic, especially if they kind of bring those sizing down a bit. Before we jump in, one small disclaimer is that the 1.0 figures sometimes do get quite loose, and yeah, this Vegeta is no exception to that rule. His leg joints especially are pretty loose. It's something you can kind of tighten up through some tips and tricks. But yeah, that's something that can be covered in a later video. Jumping over to his head articulation low, he does have some range up and down, and then some nice swivel as well. the tilting side to side isn't much. I mean, overall the articulation is pretty limited, though his head does allow him to get most of the angles that you would need for posing. Jumping into the 2.0 now, you've got the nice head swivel, the neck moves a bit more freely compared to the 1.0, and you got the full on head swivel action going on. You can swivel around, go up and down easily, and on the neck as well. Moving down, the 1.0 armor is actually, well, there is a slight joint in there, it doesn't really move, whereas the 2.01 you do have that articulation point on top. So if you need to, you can kind of lift them up to give the arms up higher. Now speaking of arms, these do have a long joint in there with the ball joint, so you do get a decent range of motion despite being a bit more limited with the armor guards there. Down to the elbows as well, you get a decent range of articulation. It kind of gets a bit hindered by his actual arm design there, although the joints are covered pretty nicely. Moving over to the 2.0, again you got the butterfly type joints in there, so it does pull around to the front a little bit more, and you can kind of get the swivel going on. And with the arm flaps up here being able to move up, it does kind of help a little bit if you want to get the arm raised up higher. And it does kind of make it a little bit easier to move around his joints if you can lift this up out of the way. The elbow range is pretty similar, and the arm joint is covered pretty nicely by the plastic in there. So I mean, overall the joints are pretty nice looking, no real ugly bits sticking out. Moving down the body now, his actual chest area is one solid section, whereas on the 2.0 we do have that extra point of articulation. I think that is one of the main reasons why this figure is a bit bigger in terms of height compared to the 1.0. I think nowadays if they made this figure they'd be able to make this Vegeta a bit shorter and smaller, with probably better range of articulation as well, especially since we do have that new Krillin coming out in about a week's time in Japan. So if they can use something like his body design on a new Vegeta, whew, that would be fantastic. Anyway, moving down to his legs and waist now, we can move his armor flaps out of the way, and you can see he does have that one solid region there for his hip and waist. So you do get the twisting motion, which isn't really hindered at all, and you can slightly pull the joint down a little bit higher to get some tilt action, but not too much. Now this is where the articulation does kind of get hindered a lot more, since you really do only have that one point. Now these ones, you can see the joint connects under his leg there. I mean, so you do have some twist action, and these ball joints will pop off pretty easily if you force them too much. But they can kind of drop down, so you can get up a bit higher, lift them up, and yeah, it gives you a bit more of a range of articulation compared to leaving him in the one set spot. His knee has a decent range of articulation, and then moves down to his foot, which can move all the way around. It does have a toe tip point as well. So you can't twist around too much, but I mean, I think it's overall, for the age of the figure, the articulation for his leg range isn't too bad. It'd just be nice if it was a bit stiffer, but that is something you can kind of fix up yourself. One common trick is to apply a very thin layer of floor polish, and just kind of thickens up the joints a little bit more, so you don't really get that loose sloppiness. Moving over to the 2.0, again we can move our flaps out of the way, and that will reveal the newer 2.0 waist and hip design. So in here we can get his legs out. Again, not a great range of articulation there, but we do have extra couple points where we can move and we can swivel the leg independently. So that's one way to kind of get a bit more of a dynamic pose going on. So you can see you've got 1, 2, 3 different points of articulation in that area. Now, being one of the earlier 2.0 figures, it is a bit more limited compared to some of the figures that we get these days. They have definitely improved quite a bit recently. So again, a new version of this figure is going to be awesome. But yeah, moving down to his knee there, that's really nice. So for his feet here, we've got a decent range of articulation as well. It does move, though the toe tip joint is a little bit more limited compared to the 1.0. He does have kind of really pointy feet actually on this figure, whereas it's a bit more rounded on the 1.0 as well. Okay, so now we've checked out the articulation, let's have a bit of a closer look at some of these faces that the figures come with, so you can kind of get a good idea of the extra detailing on the 2.0. So we've got some really nice crisscross lines on his eyebrows, and the line work on his eyes is pretty sharp as well. Whereas the 1.0 is definitely a bit more rounder, a little bit hard to see. But another big difference is the skin colouring. Since this one does have a kind of weathering, it does have that kind of warmer looking tones with kind of peachy skin colours, and which isn't too bad, though it is a little bit strong in part, whereas compared to the 2.0 Vegeta, which has no weathering at all, it's just a pretty basic skin tone colour. I think this one is a bit of a personal preference, which one you prefer. I think both are pretty nice. I think if the 1.0 was a little more similar to the 2.0 with some lighter shading, I think it would have been really nice. But I mean, you can still see the smile on the 1.0 here, but the line's definitely a bit softer and a bit more rounder in comparison. But anyway, let's change the face to a screaming one for a second comparison. Okay, so here goes the screaming face on each one. Both actually not too bad looking. You do have some definition lines on the 1.0, again with the 2.0 you have it as well, but I feel like the detailing and again the line work is definitely cleaner on the 2.0. They both have the what's that, flexing kind of popping vein on their forehead, though it's a bit easier to see on the 1.0 due to the weathering. The colouring on the inside of the mouth of the 1.0 is a bit softer, whereas definitely quite a red peachy colour on the 2.0. Both look pretty nice and just slightly different. The 2.0 does have that more angular look, whereas the 1.0 definitely does have that kind of rounder feel to it. So I think one of the biggest differences between the two figures, as mentioned earlier, is the fact that the 1.0 comes with this absolutely amazing Ki Blast set. Just one quick comment though, this stand that I'm using is a different one. The one that originally came with this figure hasn't been opened yet, so I'm just going to leave it that way and use this temporary stand here. But it is a separate key effect, and it's got the two peak holes, so you just use two stands to hold them up. And now whether you use this with the 1.0 or if you have a 2.0 figure as well and you use it with him, both looks great with either or figure, but the extra colouring and the depth and detail on here really does lend itself to the lovely weathering and the blue colouring on the 1.0 Vegeta. Now obviously if you have a white armour and you're using your blue Ki Blast, you're going to get that light bouncing back on the figure, which is one of the reasons why I think the 1.0 has that nice strong blue weathering on his armour there. It really does kind of lend itself to work in tandem with this Ki Blast. Something that I don't think we've had released in another figure actually, this kind of separate one. I hope we do get some more unique blasts like this coming through in the future, because it's awesome. Can never say no to more Ki Blasts. So yeah, Tamashii, give us more unique blasts like this for future figures, please. Okay, so one thing that I find pretty interesting, despite being different sizes, that they use the same hands. So you can put the 1.0 hands on the 2.0 if you want, and a good example of that is this hand here, which is crushing the Scouter, and now it appears to me that these are exactly the same mold. It's just that this one here on the 1.0 has that slightly darker white colour, since it does have a kind of dirty withered look, whereas the 2.0 is just a straight pristine white paint colour. So that's quite interesting that all their hands and those joints are shared between these two figures. Just like the 2.0 figure, the 1.0 has an additional head, and that is because this one has a slight slot in there, so you can attach a Scouter. Now the one Scouter that does come with 1.0 is just pink with no extra detailing. And there we go, that is the 1.0 head with the Scouter on, which looks pretty nice. This actual head hasn't really been used before, so it's a bit tight to put on the body, so I'm not going to force it on this time, but you can kind of see the design for the head is pretty similar to the it's pretty similar to the 2.0 design, but they are slightly different, so you can't really easily switch the faces around on each figure. This one has a bigger peak compared to the 1.0, and the peak placement on top is different as well. Though while the head from the 2.0 doesn't really fit onto the body of the 1.0, you can kind of place it over top. So if you have both of them and you want to put the newer head on the older body, it will sit on top, though the peg doesn't really go into place. But if you have them on a stand, you get them into a pose, it should work pretty well, despite the mismatch in colour between the neck and body and the face. But if you have them on the right angle, maybe if you're doing it for photos, you can kind of get it into an angle where the skin tones won't really make too much of a difference. So that is a possibility if you want to try and get some photos with the nicer head and the shaded body. One extra cool thing about the 1.0 is it comes with this face. It kind of has the sweat beads on his forehead marked in white, and his eyes are closed, kind of squinting in pain, which is pretty cool. So this can be used as one of those heads like when Vegeta's down on the ground after the big battle. So I think it's pretty cool to get some unique facial expressions like this, something that we're kind of lacking in the later figures, where they just tend to have this standard happy, sad, shouting look. So to get some more of those sort of agony expressions, I think it's really fun. Okay, before we jump into the final thoughts, one more thing to point out is that the tail on the 1.0 is a bit shorter and stubbier compared to the 2.0, which is definitely longer and a lighter brown colour. So let's just start with the 1.0 and we'll go for pros. Scaling, I think his size is really good, kind of a bit shorter, a bit stubbier, and it lends itself to a character really well. Second is the colouring. I much prefer the darker colour of his armour and that blue on his suit. Now this is a bit more of a personal preference, some people might prefer the colouring of the 2.0. However, 1.01 does have some wicked weathering. I love it on his legs. His armour looks really nice, though I do feel like the weathering on his chest is a little bit strong. It does look good, but if it was a bit softer, I think it still would have looked really good, being a bit more subtle. So that one there could be slightly on the con side, depending where you fall in the weathering range, if you like it really strong or light. Articulation, I think for an old figure he still holds up really well. You can get him into most of the poses that you want, either just kind of stand there powering up, a bit more of a leg spread, key blast attack, doing his gadget gun and so forth. No, some of those poses can be a bit easier on the 2.0, but for an older figure I think it's pretty good. Now onto the cons for the 1.0. The articulation is a bit of a letdown in some areas. His armor being solid is nice, but it can be a bit restrictive at times. And his inner leg area there is definitely a bit more restricted in terms of what you can do. And obviously, over time, it has become pretty loosey-goosey. Though there is something you can kind of correct yourself, and if you use a stand, or if you have some patience, you can still get him into a pose without him falling over. The plastic used on his knees is quite different to his legs, so they do stand out quite a bit. They are shiny and it has that bit more of a vibrant blue colour. So if they added a little bit of weathering on his kneecap, I think it would have been quite nice. Oh, sorry, I forgot one huge pro, and that's the effect. This is absolutely fantastic. But yeah, let's jump over to the 2.0 Vegeta. Straight away, the pros, articulation, the newer joint design is really nice. It does kind of hold itself over time a lot better, and having that extra range of articulation in here is nice. Now, one good thing about this Vegeta version, since he does have his armor flaps, it does cover that kind of ugly looking design of the joints on the 1.0. So normally that would be a pro on the 2.0, but since you can't really see it, it's kind of basically the same depending on which figure you're at. The extra chest articulation is really nice on the 2.0, and I guess the colouring, if you love that lighter colour, the 2.0 will be really good in that regard. Though I guess the main benefit for the 2.0 is definitely the facial designs. The sculpting is a lot cleaner, the extra scout here with the text on it is very nice. But yeah, in terms of cons, sizing, he's a bit higher. I think that is mostly due to the newer chest design. No weathering, he looks a bit too clean and crisp, especially in his armor. I think if the armor was a bit darker, maybe a little weathering on it, I think it would have been really good. It is nice to have on his actual suit, though I feel like it's not quite as important as his armor. Because when we look at the 1.0, the armor looks so nice, especially when you do compare it to Nappa, which does have the darker colours. The other Con is that he doesn't come with any Ki Blast effects, and he was more expensive and no stand, so you kind of get less value for money, despite it being 4 years older. If you kind of take I guess inflation, tax increases and so forth, the pricing difference kind of makes sense a little, though I do feel like he is priced a bit too high compared to the original Vegeta. But yeah, that is basically it. Both absolutely fantastic figures, worthy of any collection. So if you are trying to track down a Scouter Vegeta for your collection, you don't know which one to go for, 1.0 or 2.0, I hope this video does help. If you are trying to collect them all, definitely worthwhile picking up both of them. You can definitely find a use for them in your collections. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see more 1.0 versus 2.0 videos or any other comparison, please do let me know in the comments below, and I can try to get that video created going throughout this year. Anyway, again, thank you very much for watching. Cheers!